I'd very much like to acknowledge all the co-authors on this paper, because it would be impossible to conduct this research without this very talented group. Planned wildland fires are conducted in the pine barrens primarily to reduce hazardous fuels and the severity of future wildfires, but also to create desired conditions of forest structure and composition. And my key question here is, how can desired outcomes of planned wildland fires be optimized while reducing the impacts of smoke emissions and ember transport? And I think this is a question that we're all trying to grapple with at the moment. And so this morning, what I'd like to do is to present an overview of some of our research efforts exploring the complex interactions between fuel consumption, fire behavior, and then energy and turbulent exchange in these fires. So a little bit more high-tech work, which really are integral to smoke dispersion and ember transport during these prescribed fires. And I'm really going to take an empirical approach here and sort of provide an overview of some of our primarily field measurements during planned fires, ranging in intensity from low intensity fires to high intensity fires. And I think some of these have some unanticipated but very important results when we think about modeling or moving towards physics-based fire behavior models and the development of those models. So my three main research questions here are, how is fuel consumption related to initial fuel loading during operational prescribed fires? And what we wanted to do, we didn't want to model fuel consumption. We actually wanted to go out and measure it. So we spent a lot of time crawling around in these burns, pre and post loading, really try to develop a database of consumption of primarily surface fuels, but also some canopy fuels, and Nick's really going to address that. Secondly, what are the relationships between fuel consumption and heat flux and turbulence during low and high intensity fires? So we worked on a series of fires. And thirdly, do we really understand the factors influencing turbulence in the fire environment? This is a very complex environment, a lot of energy exchanges, turbulent exchanges. And then secondly, part of this is, how can we better apply this information to physics-based fire behavior models as we move forward? Okay, all of our burn sites are located in the Pinelands National Reserve here. We've utilized a number of tower sites, both from National Fire Plan Project and then a series of Joint Fire Science Program projects shown here in yellow. These were all dormant season burns conducted in the normal burning window and under sort of normal burning conditions for these sites. And we have received years of assistance from New Jersey Forest Fire Service, and we just greatly appreciate their help. This just could not happen without a lot of engagement with them, and they've been extremely helpful to our whole program through the years. Just some initial data. This is some data from 35 prescribed burns conducted in the major forest types that do get treated, oak pine, pine oak, and pine scrub oak here. Loading tends to increase from oak dominated to pine dominated stands, and part of this is because of the decomposition dynamics. These are all actually equally productive stands, so they're all producing about the same amount of litter and understory shrubs. The pine stands tend to be more open, so they have higher loading of understory stems. And then this is the consumption, the percent total consumption of surface fuel understory shrubs shown here. And it averages between about 40 to 55%, increasing with across the oak to pine dominance here. If we break it down a little bit more, it's primarily fine fuels on the forest floor here and understory shrubs that are consumed in the pine dominated stands. And one thing that we found that's interesting is that even in very high intensity burns in these pine scrub oak stands, that even when there's significant crowning activity or crown torching, that it's still the forest floor and the understory that's actually the major amount of fuels that are consumed. And the available fuels in the crown here are actually only a small percentage of the total, even during quite high intensity fires. So we thought that was pretty interesting, that it's primarily surface fuels that are getting consumed during these fuel treatments. And one thing we've seen is that there's a very strong relationship between fuel loading here and fuel consumption, a linear relationship, and that occurs across individual stands, but also all the way to the landscape scale. So what I've shown here, not the 35 birds, but 8 birds that I'm really going to focus on that were highly instrumented. These are where the tower sites. But if I looked at the 35 birds, I see the same thing, a highly linear relationship between fuel loading and fuel consumption, which actually is a little bit surprising, I think. And part of it is the narrow window of conditions these birds are conducted in. But it makes it really nice to be able to predict the amount of consumption in these stands, because you can actually do it from these relationships. Okay, move on to the next question here, and that is, what are the relationships between fuel consumption, heat flux, and turbulence during low and high intensity fires? And to make these kind of measurements, we actually build temporary towers within burn blocks before they're burned. One of our real workhorses here is called a sonic anemometer. And what these instruments do is that they measure wind speed in 3 dimensions and air temperature at 10 times per second. So they're operating fast enough by bouncing sound back and forth between these sensor heads to actually make some measurements at the speeds that you actually need to measure turbulence within the fire environment. Pretty close. They do have some limitations of range, and we've definitely pushed these probably beyond their capabilities, and we've cooked a few of them in fires, but for the most part, they're actually really collect some very interesting data. So here's one at 3 meters on a 20-meter tower. There's another one right there, and then one located all the way at the top. We have data loggers here in insulated boxes, heat flux radiometers, air temperature, relative humidity, a lot of thermocouples up and down these towers. So they're pretty intensely instrumented towers in these fires. In a very low intensity fire, we actually see very, very little impact. This is the high speed temperature, the temperature at 3 meters, 10 and 20. So a very low backing fire really has very little effect on the overall temperature and on vertical wind speed. So there's really not much in the way of buoyancy, heating and buoyancy created in these low intensity fires. If we move to a higher intensity fire, this is still fairly a low intensity fire. It wasn't very much crowning, a little bit of crown torching. We see a much higher temperature spike here at all 3 levels, up to about 50 degrees centigrade. And with that buoyancy, a very large spike in the vertical wind speed here. And then a very interesting phenomenon that happened. There's an influx of cooler air behind the fire front passage. And associated with that are downdrafts right here. So the vertical wind speed switches around, and we've seen this in higher intensity fires also. This is a very interesting, I think, phenomenon that's occurring in these fires. It's indicative of larger scale circulations that's driven in the fire environment. We can express this using a fairly, I guess, complex measurement called turbulent kinetic energy. And what that essentially is doing is it's taking the energy, calculating the energy in turbulent eddies. And it's calculated from the fluctuations of the 3-dimensional wind speeds. So it has a vertical component, but it also has a horizontal component. And it turns out that here, most of this is vertical turbulence associated with the buoyancy of the air masses. But back here, there's a large portion, actually a majority, of horizontal turbulence in these fire environments. So these are becoming pretty complex in terms of the overall movement of air and the turbulence associated with after fire front passage. So we then moved to more higher loading, more intense fires, smaller burn blocks for these. And this is just the setup here, is that we moved to a design that had a control tower, a nearby control tower, and then 3 towers within the burn block. It's sonic anemometer on top. We removed the intermediate ones because we knew they were just going to get destroyed. And then fine wire thermocouples. And then we buried the data loggers so we could actually handle much more high intensity fires. And these were actually lit as head fires in a number of these experiments. There's a lot of fuel loading plots in here, as well as understory towers. And so this is when the fire was initiated here. So there was a significant amount of crown torching soon after this picture was taken, as well as some crowning activity. This is the aftermath here. We've already unburied the instruments, but you sort of walk up to your towers at this point, and you just wonder what's left. Is anything left? But and so this is some of the data that was collected. There's crowning activity shown here in white in this burn. Fire was lit this way, progressed through the stand this direction. This was so hot in through here over 500 degrees centigrade, we actually damaged this sonic. She hung in there for a while, but then we pretty much melted it. Back here at this cooler burn, we actually collected some really neat data. Oh, this is the time here is 10 minutes, so it's very fast fire front passage under these towers. When the fire came back down to the ground here, cooler temperatures associated at that on that tower. This is the sonic data. This is the sonic temperature data. So here's that large spike, both with thermocouples and the sonic. And you can see the vertical wind speeds here increasing associated with those turbulent plumes. And then back behind that fire, the influx here of cooler air, I've got it in, you can barely see it right there on the scale, but with an influx of cooler air relative to that control tower shown in blue. And then here's these downdrafts here, so that following the fire front passage. When we put all these together, and what I did is I took the maximum heating, so the peak of the heating, and I calculated it as a delta, so I've subtracted off the ambient conditions here, and then the peak vertical wind speeds. There's a significant relationship between instantaneous values here and 1 second values shown here, and there's also a significant relationship between the maximum heating and the delta TKE, again calculated as a difference between the control and the burn towers. So significant relationships between the heating, the turbulence, vertical wind speed. So these are all related variables. To go back to look at consumption of the litter layer, again, just to remind us that there is a significant relationship here. But I think quite surprisingly, there's no relationships, or very poor, very weak relationships between surface fuel consumptions and some of these heating and turbulence statistics. So there's no significant relationships within here, and I think that really puzzled us. I mean, we thought, given that those two looked like they were related, or at least there was some strong relationships within them, that there should be some pretty strong relationships between the surface fuel consumption and the turbulence, some of the heating and turbulence statistics. What have we missed? Well, of course, what we really need to include are two things. One is that rate, the rate of consumption of the surface fuels. Secondly, how are they linked to crowning behavior within those? And so it's these accelerations that are where the understory is heating the canopy and moving through transition fuels up into the canopy. And so those relationships, I think, are going to be very key to understanding how the heating and the consumption of fuels are actually related to each other. So a lot more complex than just simple correlation relationships here. The good news here is, I think, is that this relationship still holds, and so that low-intensity fires that have flame fronts with a long residence time, again, a backing fire, are actually quite effective at reducing surface fuels. And so the good news there, I believe, is that these low-intensity fires that are actually still low or moderate-intensity fires can actually still be quite effective at reducing the, at least surface and energy fuels. All right, thirdly, do we really understand some of the factors influencing turbulence in the fire environment? And how might we better apply this information when we start developing our ongoing efforts to develop physics-based fire behavior models? We've seen, I think, some very interesting relationships, and this relates to the acceleration of the fire front here and the integration of surface and canopy fuels driving this crown consumption here. But then a very interesting, again, I should go back and these sites have very little topography. There's not a topography impact here. There's also there was very little variation in wind speed, in ambient winds during this. But we saw some very different behaviors where we saw an acceleration of the fire front, crowning activity here, and then a deacceleration here. The fire came back down to the ground and then accelerated again here with some crowning activity here. And so this pulsed fire behavior, this is going to be, I think, a real challenge to model this correctly as to what's going on in the fire environment. Well, of course, we've seen this behavior repeatedly, but there's interactions between turbulence and the way that the fuels, the rate of fuels that are consumed that are really going to be a challenge, I think. Secondly, this fire-induced circulation within and above canopy that's resulting in the horizontal inflow here, or the downdrafts of cooler air. We definitely need to get a handle on this because this is affecting fire behavior, the movement of fire, and also, of course, movement of oxygenated air into the back of these fire fronts. So this is again, I think, going to be a challenge to really get a handle on. The third factor is when we decompose this turbulent kinetic energy term, the horizontal component of that is actually, when we've looked at it, in all the cases we've looked at it, or in a lot of the cases that we've looked at it, that horizontal component is greater than the vertical component. So that there's a lot of other turbulence, not just associated with vertical buoyancy movement within these fires, and particularly sorry about that. Really had myself. Particularly in the back, after the flame front passage has occurred. Okay, so I think what we're grappling with now is what are the best paths forward when we think about these physics-based models, and how do we sort of incorporate some of this complexity between fuels and turbulence, heating within the fire environment. Okay, just some summary and conclusions here. At least in the Pine Barrens, it looks like the greatest amount of fuel consumption was on the forest floor and understory, and this was regardless of fire intensity. I thought that was, kind of surprising. But again, it's some of these rates are key to the actual fire behavior. Consumption is strongly related to initial fuel loading, and at least only indirectly related to the heat fluxes of turbulence above the canopy. And then I think a real key message here is that low and moderate intensity fires actually can be quite effective at reducing canopy fuels, and it really was a function of the residence time of the flame fronts that's key here. And again, crowning activity is probably linked to the rate of surface fuel consumption, and that's really what's driving this increased turbulence and energy fluxes. So it's so key for the dispersion of smoke and ember and transport in these high intensity fires. So this interaction between the rate of surface fuel and crowding is really going to be key to understand, I think. Again, we see this downward motion inflow of cooler air is associated with moderate high-intensity fires. And then finally, the turbulence in the fire environment really isn't just dominated by vertical wind velocities associated with the buoyant heat plumes, but may actually be characterized by much larger horizontal turbulence within and above the forest canopies. And with that, I don't think I've really disentangled much of anything. I think I've probably tangled it up more, but these are some of the complexities that we're trying to deal with, particularly as we try to move forward with the development of physics-based fire behavior models. And with that, thank you very much.
We have time for a quick question or two.
Yes, sir.
And how much did the ignition pattern influence that fire behavior over the course of those 8 fires that you looked at?
Very, very much so. Yes, definitely. Because if it's lit with the wind and produces a head fire, that definitely those were those higher intensity burns. Almost everything else was a backing fire. Yeah, so very strong relationship between those, the way that they're lit. But that doesn't seem to affect the surface fuel consumption. That was independent of how those fires were lit. Which I think was a little it was very interesting. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did you try different growing season or dormant season burns, and did you see any different results in that, as far as the fuel consumption, as far as the turbulence?
We have not yet, but that's a great question, because what will happen is that moisture fuels, then a lot of water vapor is going to get involved. And some of these fires, we've actually measured water vapor flux during the fires, just a small fraction of them. And those were dormant season burns, but I think you're absolutely right. That was going to change both the amount of fuel consumed, but also these turbulence and things like the water vapor flux.
And then the second part is one of the, in your picture where it went from, ground fire to crowned out, was it, and dropped back down, was the continuity of the fuel loading consistent throughout the plot, or did it vary?
Yes, it was. No, it was quite consistent. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. That's a really good question. Thank you.
This one way over there.
Yes, sir.
Yes, did you, after you guys burned, did you actually mop up the fire, or did you let it free burn before you went in to remeasure?
No, we went into you mean for the fuels afterwards, after the burns?
Yeah, did you mop the fire up after you were done with ignition?
No. Yes, sir.
Have there been any investigations in areas where there's greater topography, terrain, and if so, would it be fair to assume that those factors are going to, what would those factors do to your outcomes?
Topography would definitely make this a more complex situation because of the ambient wind flows. Also the interaction with canopies and topography. So we've been very lucky because we've been able to simplify this and still see some pretty complex behaviors, even with flat topography. Again, I think another significant challenge is where we need to go.
Are you considering that?
Well, we haven't yet. We've just been trying to work it out on the flatlands here first, I guess. Yeah, and I think running into some fairly significant complexity, even on flat. Thank you very much.
One over there.
How big was that plot?
The one that I really detailed.
Yeah.
It was about 15 acres. Yes, sir. So fairly small burn block. Some of the other burn blocks were up to about 250 acres. So they were larger scale operational.